So for this vehicle, I needed to remove the subframe in order to replace the bushings, and one of the 4 bolts holding subframe in would not come out. The bolt would spin easily but not release because the welded nut had broken free in the subframe. This is an issue you see come up quite often when working with older vehicles, especially ones with rust issues, and can be difficult and very intimidating to repair. Many shops will even refuse to perform the repair altogether. Today I'm going to take you through the steps required to kind of repair this and show you it's really not all that difficult of a repair to make. The first thing you're going to need to do is to access the welded nut or the speed nut. In most cases this means cutting a hole in the frame rail, which is where most people will walk away and shy away from this job. You'll want to keep the hole as small as possible, making it just big enough to work through. This can mean accessing with a wrench if you have a speed nut in there where you can get a wrench on it, or having to work in there with maybe a pliers or a pry bar, as I end up doing later. In my case here, I had to first remove this plate before I could access the frame rail and the welded nut inside the frame rail. The plate was spot welded on, so I had to knock out the spot welds, and then I could use the torch to heat the plate and make it a little bit easier to bend it out of the way. I didn't want to cut the plate off completely and risk damaging it to the point where I wouldn't be able to weld it back together later on, so I used the torch to heat it just so I could easily bend it out of the way. Now, one thing I should point out here is that when you're working this closely to those bushings with a torch, you're likely to set those bushings on fire, or at the very least damage them with the heat that's going into everything around them. In my case, this wasn't a big issue because I was replacing those anyway, but if you're not replacing those bushings, be extra careful to not damage them. So once that plate was out of the way, I had access to the speed nut encased just below the frame rail right behind that plate. Now normally that speed nut would be welded inside the frame rail, but in this case it was not. In this case I chose to cut a hole in the frame rail anyway so that I could access the top of the bolt. This allowed me to spray the bolt down with some penetrating oil to help get the bolt loose without having to cut it off. I didn't want to have to cut it off and then try to work a new speed nut in later on if I didn't have to. After letting the penetrating oil soak in for a while, I attempted to get the bolt out using an impact. Now the speed nut of course would still just spin in there. In this case the speed nut was just a rectangle steel block that was threaded for the bolt, and of course it was just spinning in there. So I jammed a pry bar between the speed nut and the frame to hold it in place. Now it wouldn't come loose initially, so in this case I had to use a torch to heat the speed nut before the bolt would come loose. Once I heated it, it came loose just fine. Keep in mind again that doing this could damage the bushing, most likely will damage the bushing, so if you have to go this far, you're probably going to need to at least buy a new bushing. Now with the bolt out, I was finally able to go in, get the subframe out, and do all the other work I needed to, and then come back later to repair the damage. Notice I said come back later. I'm going to put this car back together completely before I actually repair the hole in the frame and that bracket, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Now that the work is complete and it's ready to go back together, the first thing you need to do is replace the speed nut or welded nut. In this vehicle, since the speed nut is just a threaded rectangle piece of steel, I chose to weld the nut in place to the bracket underneath it. Now normally it was just encased in a bracket with 4 sides. The problem is that bracket rusted and the sides expanded a little bit, allowing the speed nut to spin. I chose to weld it to that bracket so that it would be held in place properly for any future work that needed to be done. Make sure if you're going to do that the bolt is in place and tight so that the speed nut is located in the correct position before you weld it. This will prevent future issues getting the bolt in and out later on down the road. With the speed nut securely welded in place, you can patch the hole back up in the frame. In most cases, it's best to put the biggest patch that you can in to add strength. That means putting in a patch that's significantly bigger than the hole in the frame, or at least as big as you can in the hole in the frame. This will help support it as best as possible. For this car, I had to use a smaller patch because of the bracket that had to be folded back over and welded back in place, so I couldn't support it quite as well as I wanted to, but I did use a patch that should be good enough. It did cover the hole and was slightly bigger than the hole. With the patch welded in place, you had to be careful while welding it not to burn through the metal. It's very easy. In this case, I was working with some pretty rusty and already fairly thin metal, so it was quite easy to burn in place. If you do burn through like I did, work the weld out to fill in the hole, and then I chose to grind the welds down a little bit to clean it up, and also where I had to build the weld out to burn through that hole, where the hole was burned through, I needed to grind that down to kind of smooth it all out so that the plate would fit properly once I folded it back over the top. Now the patch is put in and welded in place and grinded down, I next had to put the bracket get the bracket bent back into place. Using the torch to heat the bracket makes it a little bit easier to bend it into place. If you've never really worked much with the torch, you heat up the metal and it's just a little bit easier to move that metal around without actually breaking anything. I then use the torch to work around the edges and heat the edges, and use a hammer to kind of put the edges into place and get them as flat as possible with the frame rail. Now this is some pretty thin and rusted metal that I was working with here, so welding had to be done in pretty short stints, basically doing a lot of spot welding until I worked my way around this to keep from burning holes through the metal. Once everything is welded up, I like to grind welds down just to clean things up a little bit. Obviously, I am not the strongest welder out there. I don't do a whole lot of welding. It's not something I do real often, but I have to do it once in a while. So to clean things up a little bit, I then took some paint and painted over it. I primered and then painted over it. That one makes it look a little bit nicer. Also, it protects the metal from having rust and oxidation later on. Now, as long as the patch is done properly, you now have a plenty strong frame still in place and working, and a working speed nut for future work if anything needs to be done. So I hope this video helps you out if you ever run into this issue. Once you've done this a few times, it's really not too bad of a repair at all, although it can be very intimidating to come across. It's certainly a lot easier to make this fix than it is to go to a customer and tell them, hey, your car is junk and you need a new one because a nut in the frame broke loose. A lot of customers do not take very kindly to that at all. Also, it can be kind of difficult to replace a lot of the cars that have this issue going. A lot of them are older and rusted. This one happens to be a 1973 Dodge Charger that the customer recently purchased, so it wasn't really easy to replace. We had to do what we had to do to get it back on the road for this guy. And that's just how it goes sometimes. Sometimes you gotta do it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, head over to the channel, check out some of my other videos. Maybe you'll find something you like there as well. While you're there, go ahead and click that subscribe button, and so you get to see all of my future uploads. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.